Welcome to Vivid Box HQ. 3 years after Brexit, Britain quietly calculates the cost of leaving, and Europe is watching. Westminster, 2026. A serving cabinet minister walks to the dispatch box and says what, 3 years ago, would have ended a political career outright. Britain should reconsider its exit from the European Union. Not a backbench rebel. Not a former prime minister settling old scores in a memoir. A sitting minister. In government. Now, that moment matters less for what it achieves. It achieves nothing, immediately, and more for what it signals. The wall of political consensus that made Brexit irreversible has developed a crack. And cracks, in political structures as in physical ones, tend to widen before anyone decides to address them. The word irreversible did enormous political work for nearly a decade. Every major party, effectively, agreed to treat departure as a settled fact, not to be relitigated, not to be undone, barely to be questioned. That consensus was never a statement of policy so much as a statement of exhaustion. Britain was tired of the argument. And so the argument was declared over. What this video is not asking is whether Brexit was right or wrong. That debate has been relitigated 10,000 times on 10,000 platforms. The question here is harder. Where does Britain actually stand in 2026? What has departure cost, in numbers you can hold? What would any reversal require, in conditions that are not negotiable? And does the political will exist to face either answer honestly? 6 years since the single market ended. The ledger is finally legible. Let's read it. In 2023, UK merchandise exports settled at $490 billion, down from $522 billion the year before. The headline decline would command attention on its own. What commands more is the structural verdict buried inside it. The Office for Budget Responsibility concluded that trade with the EU had permanently declined by 15%, alongside a 4% permanent drag on overall UK productivity. Those two bars on screen, 15%, 4%, permanent losses. The data speaks plainly. That word, permanent, is doing enormous work. Not cyclical, not a post-pandemic correction that normalizes when supply chains settle. Structural, baked into the architecture of every transaction that crosses the channel. A 4% permanent productivity loss in an economy of Britain's scale compounds quietly year on year in ways that never make front pages, but do make themselves felt in wage growth, in investment decisions, in where multinationals choose to anchor their European operations. Over a decade, that is not a rounding error. It is the difference between an economy that keeps pace with its peers and one that falls, quietly and permanently, behind. The services side tells a more complicated story. A surplus of $190 billion in services exports in 2023 has kept the headline figures from looking catastrophic. But a surplus in services masks what is happening to goods. And goods are where factories live, where workers clock in, where the communities that voted most heavily for leave were promised a manufacturing renaissance, a return of the industries that had left over the preceding decades. The renaissance didn't come. The friction did. Before January 2021, a German-made component could cross into a British factory and back out again without a second glance at a border. Now there is a checkpoint in that sentence, a physical, bureaucratic, legally mandated pause. 2 to 3 days. Every time. In both directions. Follow that flow on screen. EU supplier to border checkpoint to UK assembly plant to EU customer. Friction paid in time and compliance cost at every crossing. Manufacturing accounts for nearly 10% of UK gross value added. That is not a marginal industry. That is millions of jobs across the Midlands, South Wales, and the North East, concentrated in precisely the communities that felt most economically left behind before 2016 and voted leave in the expectation that departure would bring industries back, not add paperwork, compliance departments, and customs delays to every inbound delivery. The structural cruelty is precise. Cross-border supply chains, the kind keeping major UK assembly plants globally competitive, were engineered over decades on the assumption of frictionless movement. You cannot re-engineer a just-in-time production system around a 2-day customs delay without fundamental redesign. Some manufacturers absorbed that cost quietly. Others moved production to where the border simply does not exist. Agriculture tells a parallel story. Stricter EU export restrictions for agricultural goods proved the slowest category to recover from the initial Brexit shock, with overall export volumes still falling in 2021, even as economies elsewhere in Europe bounced back. The sectors most deeply integrated with EU systems paid the steepest price for the new friction. The supply chain didn't simply slow down. It was permanently redesigned around a cost that was supposed to be temporary. Before Brexit, a bank licensed in London could sell its services across 27 European markets without a second authorization. That was passporting, one license, the entire continent. After December 2020, that right ceased to exist. Quietly, without ceremony, a paragraph in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and decades of access were gone. Financial services account for 8.4% of UK gross value added. The City of London built its continental dominance over decades on regulatory equivalence and the freedom of cross-border operation. Post-Brexit, EU-based clients face friction accessing London markets. London-based institutions face structural constraints serving EU customers. And the regulatory architectures have begun to diverge, which matters because divergence, once started in financial regulation, tends to accelerate rather than stabilize. The headline figure offers partial consolation. $190 billion in services exports in 2023, up from $184 billion the year before. London has not collapsed. Amsterdam has not replaced it. Dublin and Frankfurt absorbed activity at the margins, not in aggregate. This is apparently what success looks like now. But the question is never whether London survived. The question is the counterfactual. How much larger, how much faster growing would the financial sector be today if passporting had remained intact? That number is invisible. It exists only in the deals that were not done, the hires that went to Paris, the listings that chose Amsterdam's exchange, the asset managers who quietly redomiciled their European funds in Dublin without a single press release. The cost of absence is the hardest cost to measure. And, as it turns out, the hardest to reverse. In May 2025, representatives from London and Brussels reached a new agreement. Not re-accession, not a return to the single market. Something considerably narrower, a targeted effort to reduce the specific regulatory frictions that have ground down trade since the Trade and Cooperation Agreement came into force in January 2021. The relief in both capitals was audible, if carefully controlled. The fact that both sides needed this deal tells you something important. That original agreement had provided zero tariff, zero quota trade in goods, a reasonable foundation. On paper. In practice, the non-tariff barriers proved more economically damaging than any tariff would have been. Border checks, product certifications, the accumulated drag of regulatory divergence on labor standards and environmental rules. 4 years of that friction generated its own political logic. Neither side could afford to let the other's economy visibly deteriorate as a direct consequence of the arrangement they both signed and championed. What the May 2025 deal cannot resolve is the structural reality underneath it. Reduced friction is not zero friction. Regulatory approximation is not regulatory union. The single market is not a dial you turn. It is a legal and institutional architecture that took 40 years to construct and was dismantled in a single parliamentary vote. The distance between less friction and no friction is precisely the distance between what was agreed and what was lost. The New Deal is a patch applied to a wound made by surgery. Useful, meaningful, in the way that relief is always meaningful. Insufficient. And quietly, in the briefing rooms of both capitals, both sides are beginning to ask the same question out loud. The most honest argument for Brexit was never purely economic. It was constitutional, the question of who decides. And the answer to that question, examined in 2026, cuts in the opposite direction from what its architects anticipated. Because if Britain sought to rejoin the European Union under current treaty law, the terms on offer bear no resemblance to the arrangement that existed before 2020. Compare those two columns on screen, what Britain held in 1992 against what accession requires today. The gap between them is not a negotiating position. It is the law. In 1992, Britain secured concessions that most EU members never obtained: exemption from euro adoption, exemption from Schengen, the ability to maintain border controls. Those opt-outs were not diplomatic gifts. They were hard-fought concessions extracted by a government that held enormous institutional leverage inside a bloc it had been a full member of for 2 decades. That leverage is gone. A state applying for EU membership today applies under the Copenhagen criteria, the full body of EU law accumulated over decades, with the expectation of eventual euro adoption. Britain would join the accession queue as a candidate state, not a returning partner with preserved special status. The special status was negotiated once, held for 28 years, and surrendered in a single referendum. It cannot be reclaimed at any negotiating table. Some analysts suggest the political class on both sides quietly understands this, that the current debate about re-accession is a debate about direction rather than destination. A signal of intent from a generation that inherited a decision it did not make, not an actionable plan with a timeline attached. But signals have a long habit of becoming policy before anyone formally votes on them. The fracture at Westminster was not an ending. It was a beginning. What happens next depends entirely on whether Britain is ready to name the real terms, and whether, in 2026, the British public is finally ready to hear them. If you think Britain's economic pressure will force a reckoning, hit that like button. Share this with anyone still defending Brexit. And subscribe to see what Brussels demands in return. See you tomorrow.